You're standing in the hall of eternity, watching a young king try to hold a golden crook in his trembling hands. His sister-wife reaches over to steady his grip, her fingers brushing against his, and for a moment you see it. The same hollow eyes, the same elongated skull, the same delicate bones that seem too fragile to carry the weight of divinity. Around you, priests lower their gaze not in reverence, but in something closer to shame. The air smells of myrrh and medicine, and beneath the chanting you hear it, the ragged breathing of a god who can barely stand. He's 18 years old. He'll be dead within the year, and his body will tell a story his golden mask was designed to hide forever. Before we go deeper into this, I'm genuinely curious. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. It's incredible to me that we're all here together, separated by thousands of miles and millennia, connected by the same questions about what it meant to be human, when the rules were written by gods. The year is 1323 BC, and the young man struggling to stand is Tutankhamun, the boy pharaoh whose tomb would captivate the world 3,000 years later. But the treasure Howard Carter found in 1922 wasn't just gold and lapis lazuli. It was evidence. More than 100 walking sticks buried beside a teenage king, a body so damaged that embalmers worked in desperate haste to preserve it, and locked inside his bones, a genetic signature that would reveal one of history's most catastrophic experiments in bloodline purity. Because Tutankhamun wasn't just a pharaoh, he was the result of 11 generations of incest so methodical, so absolute, that by the time he was born, his family tree looked less like a tree and more like a tightly wound knot with almost no branches at all. The ancient Egyptians didn't practice royal incest out of ignorance or perversion. They did it because their entire cosmology demanded it. In the beginning, according to the priests of Heliopolis, the god Adam created himself from nothing and brought forth the first divine pair, Shu and Tefnut, from his own body. These twin gods then married each other, producing Geb the earth and Nut the sky. And from their union came the pantheon that ruled Egypt's spiritual universe, Osiris and Isis, Set and Nephthys, sibling pairs bound in marriage from the moment of creation. The message was clear. The gods married their sisters. The pharaohs, as living gods, must do the same. To marry outside the royal bloodline wasn't just politically dangerous, it was cosmically blasphemous. It would dilute the divine essence that flowed through the veins of Egypt's rulers, severing their connection to the celestial realm and threatening the balance that kept the Nile flooding, the sun rising, and chaos at bay. So they married each other, brother to sister, father to daughter, uncle to niece. For over 3,000 years, the royal bloodlines of Egypt folded back on themselves, concentrating what they believed was divine power, but what was actually a genetic time bomb ticking toward catastrophe. The first recorded royal sibling marriage dates to around 2550 BC during the 4th Dynasty, but it was during the 18th Dynasty, the New Kingdom period from 1550 to 1070 BC, that the practice became not just acceptable, but mandatory. Pharaohs like Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, and Tutankhamun transformed sibling marriage into dynastic policy, a safeguard against rival families and foreign influence. But what they were actually doing was creating a closed genetic loop, and with every generation the consequences grew harder to hide. Amenhotep III, who ruled from 1391 to 1353 BC, married his own sister Sitamun, and their son would inherit not just the throne, but a cascade of genetic mutations that would make him one of the most physically distinctive pharaohs in Egyptian history. His name was Akhenaten, and his appearance was so unusual that court artists had to invent an entirely new style of royal portraiture just to depict him. Gone were the idealized, symmetrical bodies of earlier pharaohs. In their place appeared a figure with an elongated skull, narrow shoulders, wide hips, a protruding belly, and limbs that seemed unnaturally stretched. Modern geneticists looking at these depictions see signs of Marfan syndrome, Froelich syndrome, or a hormonal disorder called aromatase excess, all conditions linked to inbreeding. But Akhenaten's physical deformities may have been the least of his problems. His radical religious reforms, dismantling the traditional pantheon of gods and declaring the sun disk Aten as the one true deity, shocked the Egyptian establishment and destabilized a religious system that had endured for millennia. Some historians believe his neurological condition may have contributed to his zealotry. Others see in his reign the desperation of a man whose body betrayed him daily, seeking transcendence in theology because he could never find it in flesh. When Akhenaten chose a wife, he turned to his own bloodline. Nefertiti, immortalized in a limestone bust that remains one of the world's most recognizable portraits, was almost certainly his half-sister or cousin. Despite her celebrated beauty, forensic analysis of her mummified remains suggests she too bore the marks of inbreeding, cranial deformities, dental malocclusion, and skeletal abnormalities hidden beneath the cosmetics and crowns. Together, they produced 6 daughters and a son who would inherit the throne at age 9. His name would be changed from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun as part of a political restoration, but no political decree could restore what his genetics had taken from him. Modern DNA analysis of Tutankhamun's mummy, published in 2010, revealed a truth more devastating than any curse. His parents were full siblings, not half-siblings, not cousins, brother and sister, and their son inherited a genetic lottery from hell. He had a severe clubfoot that made walking agonizing, a cleft palate that likely affected his speech, Kohler disease, which caused bone tissue in his foot to die, a curved spine that compressed his chest cavity and made breathing difficult, feminine hip development caused by hormonal imbalances, and a skull shape that matched the distinctive elongation seen in his father's depictions. The boy king lived every day in pain, propped up by canes, attended by physicians who could treat symptoms but never causes. The court artists did their job perfectly. They created images of a strong young pharaoh, standing tall with perfect proportions, wielding the symbols of divine power. The golden death mask that would become the face of ancient Egypt shows a serene, flawless ruler. But inside the tomb, buried among the treasures, was a different truth. 130 walking sticks, 46 bows designed to be used from a seated position, chariots modified with special handholds for a rider who couldn't stand unaided, and medical supplies including numerous botanical remedies for pain and infection. Tutankhamun's tomb wasn't just a burial chamber. It was a medical archive, a catalog of everything it took to keep one genetically broken boy alive long enough to wear the double crown. He died at 18. The exact cause remains debated. A chariot accident seems likely based on bone fractures, though some evidence points to infection from his clubfoot or even malaria compounded by his compromised immune system. What's certain is that his body was embalmed hastily, almost carelessly, suggesting crisis. And when Howard Carter opened his sarcophagus 3 millennia later, the mummy showed signs of having been partially burned, possibly from the spontaneous combustion of embalming oils applied in excessive haste. Even in death, Tutankhamun was mishandled, a final indignity for a life defined by biological disadvantage. But the genetic catastrophe of Egyptian royalty didn't end with the 18th dynasty. It reached its apocalyptic conclusion centuries later, under a dynasty that made the pharaohs look restrained by comparison. In 305 BC, Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's most capable generals, seized control of Egypt and founded a dynasty that would rule for nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemies were Greek, not Egyptian, but they understood that to rule Egypt, they needed to adopt its customs, including its tradition of royal sibling marriage. What started as political theater became dynastic obsession. The Ptolemies didn't just practice incest, they systematized it, creating the most genetically closed royal bloodline in human history. Ptolemy II set the template when he divorced his first wife to marry his full sister, Arsinoe II. The marriage was celebrated with ceremonies that merged Greek and Egyptian traditions, creating a new royal cult that would define the dynasty. When Arsinoe died, Ptolemy deified her, establishing a precedent that would blur the line between political marriage and religious devotion. Their union had been politically successful, which convinced subsequent Ptolemies that incest wasn't just acceptable, it was essential. Over the next 3 centuries, the Ptolemies married within their family with mathematical precision. Ptolemy VIII married his sister Cleopatra II, then after her death married her daughter Cleopatra III, his own niece. When she died, he married her daughter Cleopatra IV, making him simultaneously uncle, stepfather, and husband to the same woman. This wasn't scandal, this was standard operating procedure. By the time of Cleopatra VII, the famous Cleopatra, the royal family had been intermarrying for so long that she had only 6 distinct ancestors in 5 generations. In a normal family tree, she would have had 32. The Ptolemies had reduced their genetic diversity to less than 20% of what it should have been. The physical consequences were catastrophic. Ptolemy VIII, nicknamed Physcon or Potbelly, was so grotesquely obese that he required a team of servants to help him move through his own palace. Contemporary accounts describe him weighing over 400 pounds, sweating profusely, breathing in labored gasps, unable to walk more than a few steps without rest. His throne had to be specially reinforced. His robes were custom-made from multiple bolts of fabric, and his appetite was legendary, not just for food but for violence. He murdered family members with the same casual excess he brought to banquets. The psychological effects were equally devastating. Ptolemy IV exhibited paranoia so severe that he executed his mother, brother, and uncle in a single purge, convinced they were plotting against him. He slept in different rooms each night, employed networks of spies to monitor his own family, and refused to eat food that hadn't been tested by multiple tasters. His behavior became so erratic that courtiers began whispering about divine madness, a phrase that meant he'd crossed from godhood into something darker and uncontrollable. Modern geneticists examining the Ptolemaic record see signatures of temporal lobe epilepsy, a condition that can manifest as religious visions, paranoid delusions, and explosive violence. Several Ptolemaic rulers showed similar symptoms, suggesting this particular neurological disorder ran through the bloodline like an inherited curse. The court physicians, among the most skilled in the ancient world, developed elaborate treatments, special diets, herbal remedies, mechanical supports, but they couldn't fix the fundamental problem. Each generation was genetically weaker than the last. And then came Cleopatra. Cleopatra VII ascended to the throne in 51 BC, carrying the genetic burden of 11 generations of sibling marriage. By every biological measure, she should have been a disaster. Instead, she became one of history's most formidable political minds. She spoke 9 languages. She studied mathematics, philosophy, and astronomy. She commanded armies, negotiated with Rome's most powerful leaders, and maintained control of Egypt during one of the most chaotic periods in ancient history. But she couldn't escape her genetics entirely. Contemporary Roman sources describe her as having an enlarged head, protruding teeth, and a masculine voice, all classic markers of inbreeding. Her famous beauty was probably more propaganda than reality, a narrative constructed by Roman poets to explain how she'd seduced Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. The historical Cleopatra was likely physically unimpressive, but intellectually overwhelming, a woman whose charisma and intelligence made men forget what their eyes were telling them. Her relationships with Caesar and Antony were political alliances disguised as romance. Caesar needed Egyptian grain and gold for his civil war. Cleopatra needed Roman protection for her throne. Their affair produced a son, Caesarion, who inherited his mother's intelligence but also her genetic vulnerabilities. When Antony needed resources to fight Octavian, Cleopatra provided them in exchange for Roman military support. Their alliance produced 3 more children, all of whom showed signs of the genetic disorders that had plagued the dynasty for centuries. In 31 BC, Octavian's forces defeated Cleopatra and Antony at the Battle of Actium. The battle was decided not by superior tactics, but by the defection of Cleopatra's fleet, whose commanders had lost faith in their genetically compromised queen. Rather than face capture and humiliation in Rome, Cleopatra chose suicide on August 10, 30 BC. She was 39 years old. With her death, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended, and with it, the longest sustained experiment in royal incest ever attempted. When Octavian's soldiers entered Alexandria, they found royal palaces that had become medical facilities. Rooms once used for ceremonies were filled with surgical equipment and pharmaceutical supplies. The royal treasury was nearly empty despite Egypt's vast wealth. Generations of genetically impaired rulers had bled the kingdom dry, diverting resources from infrastructure and defense to manage the medical consequences of their closed bloodline. The famous Library of Alexandria, once the greatest center of learning in the ancient world, had been allowed to decay as successive pharaohs became too mentally unstable to value knowledge over survival. The Roman administrators who studied the captured Ptolemaic archives were horrified by what they found. Medical records detailing genetic disorders across 15 generations, financial documents showing the staggering cost of keeping broken rulers on their thrones, diplomatic correspondence revealing how foreign powers had lost respect for Egypt as its rulers became visibly weaker. The physician Galen, who visited Alexandria in 162 AD, studied these records extensively and incorporated their findings into his own medical writings. The genetic disasters of ancient Egypt inadvertently contributed to the development of medical science, as physicians struggled to understand and treat the consequences of sustained inbreeding. The legacy of royal incest extended far beyond medicine. The collapse of the Ptolemaic dynasty demonstrated that divine blood wasn't enough to sustain power. The Romans who inherited Egypt developed a very different approach: succession through adoption based on merit rather than genetics. Augustus, who defeated Cleopatra, was acutely aware that hereditary monarchy without genetic diversity was a death sentence. His solution shaped the Roman Empire for centuries. But the deeper impact was psychological and cultural. The Egyptian experiment with royal incest created a civilization-wide cognitive dissonance. Courtiers forced to worship obviously flawed rulers as living gods, priests developing increasingly desperate theological explanations for royal genetic disorders, artists creating idealized propaganda to conceal physical truth. This culture of elaborate deception influenced Egyptian art, architecture, and thought for millennia. The famous artistic style of ancient Egypt, with its perfect proportions and divine symbolism, was actually a sophisticated system of visual lies designed to hide genetic catastrophe. The weeping that echoed through palace corridors on the day Tutankhamun died wasn't just grief for a fallen king. It was the sound of a civilization confronting a truth it had spent centuries denying. The divine blood they'd worked so hard to preserve had become poison. The purity they'd sacrificed everything to maintain had made their rulers less than human. And the gods they'd invoked to justify it all had remained silent while generation after generation paid the price in pain, disability, and early death. 3,000 years later, when scientists extracted DNA from royal mummies and revealed the full extent of the genetic damage, they found something the ancient Egyptians could never have understood, but somehow always knew. In their quest to become gods, the pharaohs had forgotten how to remain human. The golden masks and towering monuments, the elaborate theological systems and artistic perfection, all of it was an attempt to hide a simple biological truth. No bloodline, no matter how sacred, can survive when it folds back on itself. Divinity requires distance, purity demands diversity. And the price of forgetting that echoes across millennia, written in the bones of kings who could barely walk, preserved in tombs built to hide what their bodies refused to forget.